Your Honor, Bryan is innocent.
Crime scene reconstruction has been described as putting together a puzzle but not having access to the box top. And not only that, you don't have access to all the pieces. So if you can imagine putting together a jigsaw puzzle, we don't have all the pieces, we don't know what the picture is supposed to look like.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti. Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I'm your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And if you see my video yesterday, you know that this case is really starting to get to me because I've seen too many things now. It's all very apparent. So gloves are off in this thing. Gloves are off. And, you know, I've discovered quite a few things over the course of my investigation into this case. Every day, more things become clear, though. Some subjects that I've kind of shied away from, though, I'm not going to shy away from them anymore. It's time to get the word out there about what's really going on in this case. In this video, I'm going to show you my interpretation of the evidence that literally goes a long way to prove that this was a not only multiple perp crime, but several perpetrators involved in the crime. And it's kind of cut and dry when you get down to this point, because there is zero transfer. We've been through this from blood from Maddie and Kaylee in the room with Xana and Ethan. According to the state, Maddie and Kaylee were attacked first. According to the state, the perpetrator would have been pretty much covered in blood by the time he was done attacking Maddie and Kaylee. When he made it into the room with Xana and Ethan, he would have blood all over his person. That blood would have transferred. Not one piece of forensic evidence shows any transfer from Maddie and Kaylee into the room with Xana and Ethan. And other than Xana's DNA under Ethan's fingernails, there isn't any blood transfer between Ethan and Xana in that room either, which that alone tells you that not only is this a multiple perpetrator crime, but the perpetrators that harmed Maddie and Kaylee aren't the same perpetrators that harmed Xana and Ethan. There was that many of them. Yeah. But in this one, we're going to go through some newly unsealed court documents. We're going to touch on some subjects that are a little bit taboo, but I believe they give us the best insight into what happened. And I'm going to go a long way in this one to try to show you why they've kept so many things hidden from you throughout this case, such as, when did Xana and Ethan arrive home? Why would that be such a secret? Everybody's always wondered. I'm going to go a long way to answering that in this one because it's becoming more and more clear to me as I put these things together and more information is released. And by the end of this, I think you will likely agree with old Pav and what he has assessed in this situation. And I'm going to teach you some new things in this one about this case. You ready? Hold on to your hats, folks, because this one is going to go up and down rather quick. Now, I'm going to start with this scenario with Xana and Ethan. And if you haven't seen the full video that I've done on all the forensic evidence in the scenario with Xana and Ethan, you probably should go watch it because that is the one thing that I've put the most time and effort in this entire investigation into. And I'll put the link to that video in the description of this video. And I believe it is the most accurate you can possibly find on the attack on Xana and Ethan. But I'm going to briefly touch on just a few points right here because they are very important. And the first point is Xana, there's no evidence she was ever out of the room, her or Ethan. It is about 99% certain, even the state agrees with it now, even though they didn't for a long time, that Xana was first attacked right inside the door. She obviously opened the door and was initially attacked in what I call position number one. And there's so much evidence to prove that. And this is totally opposite of what the state actually alleged for a long time in the case. When the state's crime scene recreation expert, Miss Sutton, produced her report on August 29th, 2024, however, they never gave this report to the defense. When they submitted her report, it was submitted at the deadline in December. And once the defense experts got her report, they noticed that her report was totally incorrect because they didn't even have the correct numbering system on the evidence. And that was all the way to January 23rd, 2025, when the defense submitted their reports for their deadline. And then what happened after that is very egregious, as I'm going to show you in this scenario. But first thing you really have to understand is between August 29th, 2024 and January 23rd, 2025, Ms. Sutton, due to the inability of the state to be able to properly assess what happened at the crime scene due to not having the correct numbering system, this is what Miss Sutton alleged. She alleged that Xana had gone to the third floor and confronted the attacker, and Xana received an injury there, and there was blood evidence of that injury. She then assessed that Xana had gone downstairs and was further attacked in the living room before making it into the bedroom and being attacked inside the door. This is exactly what she alleged. This is what was leaked to Dateline. However, after they received the defense's report, January 23rd, 2025, this entire scenario that the state had put together went out the window, and they had to revert back to what they had originally determined before Miss Sutton even got involved. And that was the state's case from January 23rd until the plea deal in July. And we know this to be a fact because of her own admission, and it's because of two stains, stain 42. And Ms. Sutton was unaware of the change in the numbering system as it correlated to the description of the agency number in the ISPF worksheets described by the defense expert Nodal. The misidentification of this sample may be associated with the renumbering system employed by Detective Payne. After further investigation, Sutton removed any DNA results for stain 42 as it appears not to have been tested for DNA. Stain 42 was blood drops on the door and the threshold of Maddie Mogan's room, as you can see in this picture right here. So Sutton removed her opinion due to the misnumbering system used by Payne January 23rd, 2025. This was their entire crime scene recreation before that date. They thought 42 actually tested for Xana's blood, which gave her this determination. That was one. Two was stain F on the beer pong table, seen on the side right here in the midst of all of the other blood on the beer pong table that actually did test positive for Kaylee Gonzalez. But Ms. Sutton thought F tested positive for Xana Kernodle up until January 23rd, 2025. And she proudly admits it right here. She will testify to the incorrect DNA profile originally attributed to stain F. And it has been corrected. An amended report is being disclosed. Is being disclosed means she hadn't even disclosed it by January 23rd, 2025. The conclusion of stating that the finding of Kernodle's blood on the table in the living room was the basis for Sutton's conclusion that Kernodle had suffered an injury at or near this table. Sutton's original reporting of DNA from stain F as being blood from Xana Kernodle was the result of her mistaken belief that the description of the stain being collected from the second floor study table was an alternative description of what Sutton referred to as the beer pong table in the living room. That's where I got it wrong in the initial assessment when I was going through this as well. I thought the second floor study table was the bar cart because it was all so confusing. But this error has been corrected, and the conclusion drawn as a result of this error has been deleted. So, after reviewing the defense's expert report and learning the numbering system was incorrect, she pretty much got rid of her entire assessment. So the state's entire belief in what happened in this case from August 29th to January 23rd was that Xana confronted the attacker, came downstairs, was injured up there, down here, and then was injured first in her room. That went completely out the window once the defense and their very small team educated the state and all of those agencies involved in what actually the crime scene showed. Now, what they were able to revert to after this was not the forensic determination of Miss Sutton, but the original determination of Detective Gilbertson in the case. And we now know this because of the new unsealed court docs show that the rebuttal expert disclosure in February of 2025 is the state disclosing Detective Darren Gilbertson of the Idaho State Police. And I was always curious why they disclosed Gilbertson as a state expert when he's just simply the lead investigator from the state. And they have to use his testimony as anticipated rebuttal testimony because the defense destroyed the crime scene recreation from their state expert. In a response to defendant's expert disclosure filed on January 23, 2025, the state may call Darren Gilbertson, detective for the Idaho State Police, to testify regarding the following. Because once the defense filed this disclosure from their experts, the state had the advantage, because they filed just general disclosures of their experts, of reading the defense's expert disclosure, realizing that they had made so many mistakes, and then they had to pivot, and they pivoted fast by disclosing Darren Gilbertson as their expert and what he was going to testify to. And what Gilbertson was going to testify to is what he had always said, that he believed the unalivings occurred between 4:07:47 and 4:20:47 a.m. We'll need to remember that. And he also conducted time runs of the 1122 King Road crime scene. And then they attached his timed run report that we've all seen from the Idaho State Police that he did way back July 26, 2023. A far cry sooner than the crime scene recreation done by Sutton, the state's expert. But why did they have to revert back to this? Because of those misattributed DNA results that Sutton used. And it becomes very clear that once you go to what Darren Gilbertson was going to testify to, Detective Talbert counted and kept track in an attempt to recreate the movements and motions believed to occurred based on the evidence collected and autopsy reports. Remember autopsy reports. I moved out of the bedroom, down the stairs, through the living room, down the hallway, and into Kernodle's bedroom. Again, with the assistance of Detective Talbot, I simulated the number of strikes that were inflicted upon Kernodle and Chapin. You see, the state's expert opinion of Xana being attacked upstairs and in the living room went out the window. Now, Maddie and Kaylee's attacked upstairs. The perpetrator goes all the way into Kernodle's bedroom and then attacks Kernodle and Chapin. The state had to revert back to their original assessment. Once again, he says, I exited the bedroom, moved back downstairs through the living room, down the hallway, and into Kernodle's bedroom. The movement to Kernodle's bedroom was slower than the first run, but still somewhat quick. I again simulated the movements and motions that took place inside Kernodle's bedroom, eliminating everything that happened in the living room altogether. And his time frame for his timed runs was 2 minutes and 6 seconds and 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Completely ignoring all of the blood stains in the living room, on the stairwell, on the pong table, on the half wall, by the bar cart. I mean, as if it just didn't exist whatsoever. And considering none of those samples came back to Xana, we all now know that a likely attack happened in the living room with Kaylee because it was her DNA results that were found in the living room. So, keeping that in mind, though, it gives us a little bit of insight into how the state tried to pivot and where they were wrong and where they were likely correct, because they are correct, in my humble opinion, of what happened in Kernodle's room to an extent. But it does bring us back to this position right here, which once again, Ethan is on the bed. Xana opens her door and she is attacked in what I refer to as position number 1. And there is much evidence for this scenario, and even agreed upon by the state's expert, with the directionality of the spatter stains, where Xana first opens the door, marker 29. She's approximately 3 feet 7 inches above the floor when attacked. There is blood dripping down the door where this occurs. There is blood spattered on the door up high where this occurs. But most importantly, the spatter assessment on the light switch and the directionality of the spatter showing the area of convergence right at the opening of the door proves that this is the area of attack number 1. However, the next area is the most important area in the crime scene, because once Xana is attacked right here, she goes back and to the right, to the far right corner. And this is the critical part of the entire crime. We know this to be a fact because the area where Xana was found, where she expelled the last bit of blood, was right in this area. And because there isn't any visible footprints or shoe prints in the expelled blood, tells us that Xana's feet and the perpetrator's feet were in this area prior to her last bit of bloodletting. That could only have occurred if she was attacked through this area before the blood arrived there. And we know that to be a fact because once law enforcement used the amido black in that same spot, they uncovered foot and toe prints and shoe prints, likely from the perpetrator, foot and toe prints from Xana, indicating they were in this area during the attack before the blood was deposited on the floor. Again, before the blood was deposited on the floor, their feet prints were all in this area, proven by the use of the amido black. This is what it was like once they removed Xana from this position. And the position they removed Xana from was right here. And underneath her was that position where we just seen the amido black that created the footprints and the toe prints in that area, which means that when Xana was first struck, she went back to this area. The foot and toe prints are proof of that. And then the second area of proof is the spatter in that area on the wall by the mirror. And the spatter is going in a downward position. And even the state expert agreed that the shape and area of conversions of these spatter stains indicate the source of blood was slightly above the level of these stains, which means if the injury is occurring above the level of these stains, Xana is still standing when she's in this position in the rear corner. That is key because as she goes back and she is attacked, she is still standing here as indicated by the blood spatter on the wall right here. And the lack of footprints until the amido black is produced right here is proof of that as well, and also proof that she left that position and their next position was going to be over here by the bed in position 3. And you can see the angle of the footprints is going from this direction. So this is critical because as Xana is being attacked over here, a alert and awake Ethan would have more than enough time to respond to this, get out of bed and go over and assist Xana. And we would have to be ridiculous thinking to think that that would not have happened. The only way that the state could make this case, though, is if Ethan is completely passed out in this scenario. But we know that's not the case. We know that as Xana goes back and is attacked in this area, perpetrator number 2 comes in and attacks Ethan. And to think Ethan was asleep at this time, at this stage of the game, is incorrect thinking, and I'm about to show you why. Because Mr. Ethan, God rest his soul, we now know that from all of the interviews that were conducted with his frat brothers, the types of questions law enforcement was asking them and the responses that they were given was Ethan was an avid user of amphetamines, prescription amphetamines. Now, we also know, and it's not a knock on Ethan, it's what a lot of college kids do, but we also know that in the crime scene, on the desk in Xana's room, they found a baggie containing blue powder that was tested on lab report, I believe it was lab report 25, and it's a lab item number 71, Ziploc bag with trace of blue powder. And the conclusions and interpretations from that result was that it was tested positive for amphetamine. So next to that bag of blue powder, though, was the rolled up dollar bill showing us how that powder was ingested. And that becomes a critical part to this case. It wasn't just that he had consumed his drug of choice, it was the manner in which he consumed it and the results you could expect from there. Now, in the autopsy report, it shows 2 measurements for Ethan. 1, blood alcohol concentration of 0.122 and a very increased level of amphetamine in his blood of 260 nanograms per milliliter. A lot of people have speculated that this was a toxic level because of the amount found in the blood. I'm going to show you it's not, and I'm going to show you the reason for this elevated number and the results of what that elevated number means. Now, for the entire case, we have all never been able to put an exact time to when Ethan and Xana arrived home, and it's something that law enforcement has tried to keep from us this entire time for some reason. I'm going to now show you one of the main reasons why that is. We know by looking at the timeline that the last verified statement from anybody involved in the case was a witness statement from Dylan. Nobody likes to believe Dylan, I understand. But in this case, she testified that, or didn't testify, but she gave a statement saying that she went to bed around 2:10 a.m. and when she went to bed, Ethan and Xana hadn't arrived home yet. Now, we also know that a DoorDash delivery was made at 3:59 a.m. It is likely that Xana and Ethan returned home between 2:10 and 3:59. When they arrived becomes very critical because we can now assume that once they arrived is when this was consumed. And that plays a very critical part in this because the DoorDash delivery was made at 3:59 a.m. Gilbertson down here says that the crime happened between 4:07:47 and 4:20:47. So that's about 8 minutes after the DoorDash delivery was made is where he says the crime could have started. So that means somewhere between 3:59 and 4:07, Xana or Ethan must have gone downstairs, retrieved the DoorDash from the front porch, taken it back up to their room, made a plate in the kitchen, gone into the room and began consuming it, which I would assume would take a considerable amount of time, probably more than 8 minutes. But the key to all of this is when did they get home? Because when they got home is likely when this was consumed. And here's something that you have to understand about this particular method of consumption and what it does to the level in your blood. With a high concentration of the drug in Ethan's blood and the likely way that it was ingested, yes, snorting Adderall, nasal insufflation is the reason why this is so elevated. It significantly elevates the amount of drug found in the bloodstream compared to oral ingestion. The only way that we can truly verify that, though, is to know where they tested Ethan's blood from. Was it blood from his bloodstream or was it blood from his already digested blood, already processed blood coming back from a vein? And we have an absolute answer to that, and it verifies this 1,000%. This method alters the drug's pharmacokinetics by delivering it directly through the nasal mucosa's dense capillary network, bypassing the digestive system and liver. The physiological effects of snorting it include higher peak concentration. It can result in 30 to 40% higher bioavailability than oral administration because it skips the first pass liver metabolism. That's why you see such an elevated number. And faster absorption. The drug enters the bloodstream within 3 to 5 minutes. Peak plasma concentrations typically arrive within 1 to 2 hours, which is much faster than the roughly 3 hours or 78 hours for required oral doses. So now this 1 to 2 hour period of when this happened becomes critical because that's when he would feel the peak effects of it. Isn't that strange? 1 to 2 hours. We don't know when they arrived home. That just happens to be the time frame when the peak effects of that drug would be felt in his system. But when you do it this way, you have a couple of side effects that you have to be aware of. And somebody who does it consistently is probably not going to have a lot of these side effects, but you can bet insomnia and aggressiveness is going to be a couple of them. So to say that Ethan was in bed asleep is ridiculous. And to further verify this point, we have to go to the rebuttal expert disclosure for prosecution expert Gary Dawson that was just released in the new unsealed reports as Exhibit S6, anticipated rebuttal testimony. Now, Gary Dawson is an expert witness in pharmacology and toxicology, and he was particularly going to testify about the degree of impairment of victims, particularly Maddie Mogan, but he puts a lot more information in this report than that. Specifically, in his exhibit on February 10th, 2025, he goes on to tell us the toxicology report dates from the laboratory conducted on Kaylee, which is December 12th, on Maddie, which was November 30th, and then Xana and Ethan, which was December 5th, 2022. Then he also incorporates statements of Brett Payne, which is likely the probable cause affidavit, and Dustin Blaker. And then also personal communications from the pathologist, Dr. Veena Singh, who performed the autopsies. He goes on to give his background, but then he goes on to make this statement, which gives us all the insight we need. He talks about cavity blood, which cavity blood would be blood that accumulates in your body cavity outside of your normal functioning organs and veins and arteries. But cavity blood is the least preferred source for drug analysis. It can still be instructive under certain circumstances, particularly with alcohol, as alcohol distributes throughout the body water. So the least preferred source is cavity blood, according to him. And when we look at his summaries and conclusions, he gives us a little bit more insight. I have limited my review to that of Maddie Mogan. However, the same general principles would apply to Kaylee Gonzalez. So Maddie, her blood was alcohol consumption or distribution was obtained from the least preferred source, which was cavity blood. Same with Kaylee. Now Xana, it was with peripheral blood. So peripheral blood, different than cavity blood, but we would need to look further into that to determine how much Xana was actually impaired from her alcohol consumption. But it gives us definitive answers on Ethan. Ethan's blood that was tested was cardiac blood, which means directly from Ethan's bloodstream. So when you look at the elevated levels in his bloodstream, along with the likely consumption method, it tells us that everything that we just talked about is likely correct. So with the likely consumption method right there on the table next to where they were found, and the elevated number in the bloodstream tested from his cardiac blood, it tells us that it was recently consumed, and he would be experiencing those high levels of insomnia and the other effects of stimulants. And it wouldn't be affected too much by his low blood alcohol concentration of 0.122, I wouldn't think, considering the state's experts' toxicology report gives us a table of what kind of effects this would have on him. And 0.122 would put him at the very top of the euphoria stage as far as what effects he would be feeling with his alcohol consumption, and right in the early stages of excitement. And one thing that it does point out in the excitement phase is increased reaction time that Ethan would experience just simply from his alcohol consumption. Compound that with his likely ingestion method of the stimulant and the high concentration in his bloodstream tells us Ethan would be very alert and quick to react. So when Xana goes back to position number 2 and she's being attacked, the likely movements from Ethan would have been to get off the bed and go and assist her. But he couldn't do that because attacker number 2 had come in and began attacking him as well. And that is what the crime scene evidence shows in detail. Filed February 24th, 2025, motion in limine number 2, vague and undisclosed expert testimony, filed by the defense team. And they were pretty clear in this request to the judge to limit the testimony from the state. And one of the things that they wanted to limit was Detective Gilbertson. The state did not disclose Detective Gilbertson in their initial disclosures, but instead listed him as a rebuttal witness. The state did not identify any specific expert or opinion the detective will rebut because they had to scramble, because once they received the defense's expert disclosures, their crime scene recreation specialist had the entire crime incorrect based on incorrect numbering. Moreover, the court should exclude the testimony under 403B. The relevance of this testimony is minimal at best, and it carries a serious risk of juror confusion. I'll bet. The detective walked alone through a house that he's intimately familiar with in the middle of broad daylight more than a week after the house had been vacated and changed significantly due to an unaliving investigation. He simply counted out loud upon entering the rooms. This is a far cry from what the state alleges occurred, because they had already seen the state's expert opinion. So this is before they received the state expert's new revised opinion that was later given to the defense after they had the access to the defense reports, which is what the defense was arguing in this motion. Late disclosed expert opinions do not allow the defense sufficient opportunity to conduct the follow-up investigation necessary and puts the defense at a significant disadvantage. And they go on to show the legal argument to why that should never happen. But prejudice is magnified in a criminal case when the state has the advantage of the defendant's expert disclosures in drafting their initial expert opinions. The state has the resources of dozens, if not hundreds, of people working on its behalf from various state and federal agencies. It has the advantage of technology that is available only to law enforcement agencies, not to the defense. It is bringing the full resources of the state of Idaho to bear alongside assistance from the federal government. And while Mr. Kohberger has a defense team consisting of 3 attorneys, 1 investigator, and 1 mitigation specialist, who must not only review all the state's evidence, but conduct an independent investigation into both the circumstances of the crime and in Mr. Kohberger's entire life history. The pre-existing resource disparity must be taken into account when assessing the additional tactical advantage the state has improperly obtained. Notably, the state did not seek modification of the scheduling order to allow for a later disclosure deadline, which would have equally applied to the defense and would not have given the prosecution a tactical advantage. It is fundamentally unfair for the state to shirk the court's order and recap the tactical advantage of being able to review the defense experts' opinions before making their initial disclosures, in addition to the already existing advantage in the resources. So what they're saying, and now it becomes so clear, is because the defense filed their expert disclosures and the state filed theirs late, they got to read the defense's expert disclosures, realized that with all of the state's resources, they had made mistakes because they didn't figure out the numbering system of the evidence, which totally destroyed their entire theory on the crime. And they had to pivot, and they pivoted based on the defense's experts' disclosure, and they pivoted with Gilbertson's original assessment. That is the egregiousness of the situation. The judge must have known it, and he denied this motion in limine. This was a travesty of justice in the highest form, but now we have more information to know what truly happened. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, your thoughts, your criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.